here last week, but I hope that you were able to catch up on it because I'm going to do the barest of summary here. And the barest of summary is to say, a la Irwin, who did the original research and then about 13 years of additional research on the subject of the green warbler, which was supposed to be the most classic example of a ring speciation event that we've observed, and ring speciation being sort of the best examples of speciation that we've observed. And you know, Irwin admits that even in 2001, the evolutionary divergence of a single species into two has never been directly observed in nature, and the reason is, of course, the appeal to time. Speciation just takes a really long time to occur, and this correlates, and we're going to be talking today about one of the key features of Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, is the idea of gradualism, the idea of long periods of time, sometimes millions and millions of years, for any noticeable morphological differences to occur within a population of a species until you finally get enough of a daughter species appearing that maybe it makes it into the fossil record, or you know, if you were able to be around for that long, you'd be able to observe that daughter species branching off. So the idea is Darwinian gradualism over long periods of time. And so all evolutionists ultimately are going to point to the fossil record and trot out examples of speciation that we see in the fossil record. So what does the fossil record actually show? Well, Darwin, in his day, believed that the fossil record was ultimately going to validate his theory. He himself recognized that there were gaps in the fossil record, significant gaps in the fossil record, and he believed that the missing transitional forms between the big branches of different species and different body types, that these big transitional forms would ultimately be discovered. Now, we're 150 years later. Tremendous amounts of digging have taken place. Every corner of the globe has been dug up looking for fossils. And the appeal to the future, we may discover more and more things to fill the gaps, that's becoming a very, very lame, even desperate kind of argument at this point, because no longer, as in the time of Darwin, are we in a case where we can say, well, we really don't know. We haven't dug that much. Maybe we're going to find more. We are seeing that there are way more gaps than there are any interlocking pieces. So Darwin's transitional forms in the fossil record, at best, we're going to look at one of the classic examples today. Again, since I can't cover the whole spectrum, my favorite approach is to, in charity to evolutionists, pick one of their exemplar best cases and evaluate it, because they're the ones saying, this is the great example of transitions appearing in the fossil record. So we're going to look at one of their best examples today and see what issues emerge with that. So at best, we're seeing very, very few, a handful maybe, of any kind of transitional lineage in the fossil record. And these transitional fossils prove to be highly interpretational, as you'll see. Furthermore, there's a really crucial point here that matters, and that is, think about the different speciation concepts. Can anyone remember off the top of their head what's the best of the speciation concepts and why? Who said it? Yep, the biological species concept is the best one. Why?
Number one.
Ah.
Well, does it have to do with the, is that the, with the moths? Is that the one that, in terms of adaptation, in terms of...
Okay, so the issue is you accumulate enough adaptations and ultimately you get a speciation event.
Yeah.
Okay, now there's all sorts of different ways of defining what a species is, and hence when one species becomes truly another.
Yeah.
We're referring here to the TSC, which was the first one I mentioned, the taxonomic species concept. That's the morphological one. look, feel, function, right?
Yeah.
We evaluate how the two things look, and so there you might be able to say, well, you got white moths, you got black moths, you know, there's a significant taxonomical difference between the two, but wait, what's taxonomy? Well, taxonomy is the ordering, the dividing of different things into more and more fine-grained bits, putting them in smaller and smaller and more fine-grained boxes. Okay, well, so can you really say that the peppered moth is two different species because you have a black and a white? No, it doesn't even count as a case of legitimate adaptation. I'm kind of reviewing more now. Well, why is it not a case of legitimate adaptation? Because the adaptation, quote unquote, the adaptation was not produced by any kind of mutation in the genome, and there's no persistent change in the genome of the population. You've always had light-colored and dark-colored moths, and you might change the statistical distribution, but the genetic code of the species hasn't changed. There's no persistent change. So there's been no adaptation in the species. There just always have been light-colored, dark-colored moths, and just a mere statistical distribution change does not qualify as a genuine adaptation. Although scientists like to trot it out as a classic example of adaptation, that's not true adaptation. Okay, so it's not even adaptation. This gentleman has a...
Oh, I was just wondering how far back, is there a date of record? How far back does the records show on a date?
Are you talking about the moth?
Yeah.
We're talking the early 1900s because that's when the Industrial Revolution took place in the UK. And what caused the shift from the light-colored moths to the dark-colored moths was the pollution from the factories that was coating the birch trees and poplar trees, which are light-colored trees, was coating their bark with so much soot that the tree trunks became very dark. And so the light-colored moths then stood out, and the birds were picking them off. But the dark-colored moths weren't as easily seen. They were more naturally camouflaged. So this was observed over the period of about a 60-year period.
What is this, early 1900s?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that doesn't even qualify as a taxonomic speciation event, because what's the smallest taxonomical piece? Well, species. I mean, that's where scientists need to be able to divide between two types of things, two kinds, if you will. And we don't have two kinds here with light-colored and dark-colored moths. So you get into all kinds of problems with the taxonomic speciation concept. It's called folk or crude because it's very coarse-grained. You look at two things and say, Chihuahua, Great Dane. Very different. Different enough to be two different species? Well, no. Okay, what about our little Bengal cat and a tiger? Well, they call that two different species because taxonomically, right, they look different enough. Well, what does different enough mean, right? Clearly, they're not two different species from the point of view of the biological speciation concept, which is, we called it the only game in town because it's the only game that actually gets for evolutionists what they need. What do they need? They need to be able to account for the fact that elephants cannot interbreed with human beings. Somehow, over the course of time, even on their model, branches occurred that made differentiations between kinds so big that they lost the ability to interbreed. And so the reproductive capacity proves to be the best account scientists can come up with of when a branch has really taken place. Yes, Ann?
That's what I was going to ask about, because you told about, and I can't remember what the thing was, but anyway, that separated at one point, but when they got to the other end of the valley, they still could breed.
Yes.
So they were still the same species.
Exactly. And Yeah, and both in the case of the greenish warbler moving from south to north, and in the case of the Ensatina salamander moving from north to south, in both of the two supposedly really classic cases of ring speciation, what you find is that scientists ultimately admit it's not even clearly a ring. There was not even clearly the migration that was originally thought to take place. There was a lot of genetic material coming in from the outside. Who knows but what this was just always a population of salamanders or always a population of green warblers. And so we don't have the kind of adaptation accumulating during migration that would make this a really awesome speciation example.
So even if they if they bred with other salamanders who were along the route, they still are breeding, and when they get to the other end of the circle, or ring as you called it, they still could breed with each other as well as the one coming from the other side.
Exactly. Yeah, so the thing that would make it a speciation event would be if, in fact, they could not interbreed. And that's part of the problem, right? With any speciation concept, the BSC being the best we've got for sexually reproducing creatures, the problem you're facing is that because they don't prefer to doesn't mean they cannot. Well, that ties in with the ecological species concept, the idea that they occupy different ecological niches. Hence, they've become so separated, they've become so divergent that we can fairly call them two different species. So leopard cats in Asia are very, very different in terms of their ecological niche and their behaviors and so forth from tabby cats. And so you might be inclined to say they wouldn't interbreed, they don't interbreed. Notice the word don't as opposed to can't, right? But somehow you've got to get from bunches of don'ts to genuine can'ts, because somewhere along the line, what evolutionary theory has to explain is how you got elephants and human beings that cannot interbreed, right? The genetic differences between us are such that there is no possibility of combining these genomes to get a viable product out of them. And so somehow evolutionary theory has to explain how you get from there to here. There's got to be genuine speciation events, and those have to be genuine biological speciation events. Now, think about these speciation events in terms of the fossil record. All of the problems that we see with trying to decide if a given pair of cichlid fish can interbreed, those problems are all the worse when you go into the fossil record. You take two creatures from the fossil record, usually partial skeletons. Now, what can you conclude with any reliability about the capacity of these two creatures to interbreed? They look a lot alike, right? I mean, evolutionary theory is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here because they need to show gradualism, right? They need to show slight morphological differences in the fossil record, but as we've already seen, big morphological differences like Chihuahuas and Great Danes, or Asian leopard cats and tigers, or cheetahs and tabby cats and so forth, huge morphological differences doesn't necessarily mean that they can't interbreed.
Thanks. Yeah, I believe that the Egyptians bred animals to come out with, like, the cheetah. That's what I understand from history, that that man has bred animals to come out with other types of animals for certain purposes.
Yeah, and it could well be.
Where the cheetah was bred to hunt for the pharaohs.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that that's true, but there's nothing in principle to keep it from being true. I mean, the bottom line is what we're finding is that a lot of what we thought were pretty huge disparities between creatures actually are not that great, that within entire ranges of cattish type creatures, you get interbreeding. And so the problem is if you stick this concept into the fossil record, it makes it very difficult to say this fossil is clearly a different species than this fossil, which means we had a speciation event somewhere in this pile of strata. So you're stuck with the taxonomic speciation concept because you're unable to even begin to talk about interbreeding. All you can do is look at morphology. So as we evaluate fossils, that's what scientists are left with, is the taxonomic species concept. So think about the strengths and weaknesses of the taxonomic species concept and realize that's what you're doing, that's what paleontologists are doing when they're evaluating the fossil record.
Question on that. So just in terms of the speciation, not the speciation event, but just the speciation concept, the filter is, refresh my memory, is reproduction. Is there another filter with that in the definition, or is simply reproduction the primary filter of?
Well, we've got the three different major speciation concepts, right? The taxonomic,
right,
the ecological, biological.
Yeah.
And they're all trying to differentiate, you know, box entities up, categorize them differently based upon different sorts of, well, with taxonomic, you're talking morphological differences primarily, right?
Okay. Yep.
Okay. And then there was the phylogenetic speciation concept, right? And the phylogenetic one is the smallest possible observable difference. It's come to be basically cladism, where it's looking at genetic markers and it's divvying species up according to particular molecular analysis of the genome. But again, you can't employ that with fossils, right? So ecological, well, it's pretty hard to deduce anything reliably. I mean, we're going to see. There's some really wacky inferences that have been drawn by things like how much salt content is in their bones and things like that, where they're trying to decide something about ecological niches, but this is incredibly sketchy stuff. You can't do the biological. You can't really do the phylogenetic. The ecological is sketchy at best. I mean, it's really bad. You're left with the taxonomic. You're left with morphological differences. So you're looking at how fossils look, and you're trying to divvy creatures up on the basis of what the fossils look like and what you can interpolate about how the creatures look, acted, possibly bred, right? But all this is derived from bones. Now, that brings us to a huge contrast, and that's really the topic of this lecture today, is the contrast between, as I cast it, Dawkins, Richard Dawkins' orthodoxy, contrasted with Gould and Eldridge's, what's often been called unorthodox view of speciation. And we're going to get into exactly why this kind of divide in the paleontological and scientific community has emerged since the early 70s. What has driven this divide in paleontology, and is it really a divide? It's often cast in the literature as a divide, but Gould, for example, would deny that there was a divide. But we're going to get into what's driving this, because, again, our goal is to get into the evolutionist paradigm. Our goal is to see through their lens. And you know, in researching this very topic, it's astounding to me how confused so many creationists are. And it's doing us no credence to be wildly confused about what the scientists are actually claiming. Okay, so Dawkins takes the orthodox position. We're about to look at a short video clip of Dawkins in a lecture here about this very thing. Dawkins says, gaps? Yeah, okay, there's been gaps in the evolutionary record, you know, since Darwin. We've done a lot of digging, there's still gaps. So what? Big deal. There's gaps in the fossil record. The gaps are just what you would expect, right? And evolution is perfectly secure as a theory, completely regardless of any gaps in the fossil record. In fact, we would expect there to be lots of gaps in the fossil record. We would expect there to be an almost non-existent fossil record. Because if you think about what it takes for fossils to occur, it's really unlikely. So the fact that we've been able to dig up as much as we have is actually amazing. And in what we've dug up, we've seen amazing lineages, Dawkins says. And so he says creationists make much of the gaps, and they're all about the gaps, and they're gap, 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 gap. But they have to constantly retreat to a God of the gaps, right? Which is really lame argumentation. We have a totally secure theory, gaps or no gaps, you know, don't make so much of the gaps. This is Dawkins' view. Okay, well, let's watch him. So let's watch the first one, which is, I think it's even named with Dawkins in the name. It's a little jerky, I'm sorry for that, but the sound should be better.
Which is called Missing Link. What do you mean, missing? Creationists are deeply enamored of the fossil record because they have been taught by each other to repeat over and over the mantra that it is full of gaps. Show me your intermediates. They fondly, very fondly imagine that these gaps are an embarrassment to evolutionists. Actually, we're lucky to have any fossils at all, let alone the massive numbers that we now do have to document evolutionary history, large numbers of which, by any standards, constitute beautiful intermediates. We don't need fossils in order to demonstrate that evolution is a fact. The evidence for evolution would be entirely secure even if not a single corpse had ever fossilized. It's a bonus that we actually do have fossils. A rich seam of fossils to mine, and more are discovered every day. The fossil evidence for evolution in many major animal groups is wonderfully strong. Nevertheless, there are, of course, gaps, and creationists love them obsessively. In an earlier chapter, I made use of an analogy to explain how we can make inferences about evolution because we come late to the scene. We're not there to watch evolution happen most of the time, although there is a chapter called Before Our Very Eyes, which does show that there are some very rapid pieces of evolution that we can see. My analogy is that of a detective who comes to the scene of a crime, a scene of a murder, obviously after the murder has been committed. So there are no eyewitnesses to the murder. The detective can't see the murder, but can make inferences by looking at clues that remain. And that's the position that we're in finding the evidence for evolution. So let's make use again of our analogy of the detective coming to the scene of a crime to which there were no eyewitnesses. The baronet has been shot. Fingerprints, footprints, DNA from a sweat stain on the pistol, and a strong motive all point towards the butler. It's pretty much an open and shut case, and the jury and everybody in the court is convinced that the butler did it. But a last-minute piece of evidence is discovered in the nick of time before the jury retires to consider what had seemed to be their inevitable verdict of guilty. Somebody remembers that the baronet had installed spy cameras against burglars. With bated breath, the court watches the films. One of them shows the butler in the act of opening the drawer in his pantry, taking out a pistol, loading it, and creeping stealthily out of the room with a malevolent gleam in his eye. You might think that this solidifies the case against the butler even further. Mark the sequel, however. The butler's defense lawyer astutely points out that there was no spy camera in the library where the murder took place, and no spy camera in the corridor leading from the butler's pantry. He wags his finger in that compelling way that lawyers have made their own. There's a gap in the video record. We don't know what happened after the butler left the pantry. There's clearly insufficient evidence to convict my client. In vain, the prosecution lawyer points out that there was a second camera in the billiard room, and this shows through the open door the butler, gun at the ready, creeping on tiptoe along the passage towards the library. Surely this plugs the gap in the video record. Surely the case against the butler is now unassailable. But no, triumphantly the defense lawyer plays his ace. We don't know what happened before or after the butler passed the open door of the billiard room. There are now two gaps in the video record. ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my case rests. There is now even less evidence against my client than there was before. Well, I hope you get the point from that. The fossil record isn't actually necessary. There are occasional gaps in the fossil record, but to listen to the way creationists use those gaps, you'd think that to find a gap and the rare places where there is a gap somehow weakens the case for evolution. One of the main places where people have alleged that there are gaps in the fossil record is the so-called missing link, the alleged gap that separates us, humans, from other apes. So I'm going to read a little bit from the next chapter, which is specifically about human evolution and the now very rich fossil evidence that we have for human evolution. Molecular evidence shows that the common ancestor we share with chimpanzees lived about 6 million years ago, or a bit earlier. So let's split the difference and look at some 3 million year old fossils. The most famous fossil of this vintage is Lucy, classified by her discoverer in Ethiopia, Donald Johanson, as Australopithecus afarensis. Unfortunately, we have only fragments of Lucy's cranium, but her lower jaw is unusually well preserved. She was small by modern standards, although not as small as Homo floresiensis, the tiny creature the newspapers have irritatingly dubbed the Hobbit, which died out tantalizingly recently on the island of Flores in Indonesia. Lucy's skeleton is complete enough to suggest that she walked upright on the ground, but probably also sought refuge in trees, where she was an agile climber. There is good evidence that the bones attributed to Lucy really did all come from a single individual. The conclusion from studies of Lucy and her kind is that they had brains about the same size as chimpanzees, but unlike chimpanzees, they walked upright on their hind legs as we do. Lucy's were a bit like upright walking chimps. Their bipedality is dramatically confirmed by the poignantly evocative set of footprints discovered by Mary Leakey in fossilized volcanic ash. They are usually attributed to a pair of Australopithecus afarensis walking together, perhaps hand in hand. But what matters is that by 3.6 million years ago, an erect ape walked the earth on 2 feet, which were pretty much like ours, although its brain was the size of a chimpanzee's. It seems quite likely that the species we call Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's species, included our ancestors of 3 million years ago. Other fossils have been placed in different species of the same genus, and it is virtually certain that our ancestors were members of that genus. The first Australopithecine to be discovered and the type specimen of the genus was the so-called Taung child. At the age of 3.5, the Taung child was eaten by an eagle. The evidence is that damage marks to the eye sockets of the fossil are identical to marks made by modern eagles on modern monkeys as they rip out their eyes. Poor little Taung child, shrieking on the wind as you were borne aloft by the aquiline fury, you would have found no comfort in your destined fame 2.5 million years on as the type specimen of Australopithecus africanus. Poor Taung mother, weeping in the Pliocene.
Richard, when was that? When did he do that? When is that recorded?
You know, I don't know. It's on the website.
Okay.
I don't know off the top of my head. This is a book that he recently wrote, and you can tell he's reading parts out of it. So it looks to me like he's actually on a book tour and lecturing out of his book as part of the book sales tour.
And the science community is still holding on to Lucy, even though...
Oh, yeah. I mean,
even though
Artie, do you remember when Artie hit the newsstands?
Yeah.
Until finally it came out that this was a totally fragmented, utterly crushed, just ground into oblivion skeleton. And this is one of the biggest problems that the paleontological community has, is you notice how he blithely pops off with like it is known and it is certain that and evidence is clear that and blah, 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 and ends up coming to conclude we had a little ape-sized thing that was walking around on 2 feet, and we know that from footprints. Well, wait, were the footprints leading to that fossil? Or were they, I mean, his analogy of the butler and all the evidence we have and how creationists are just being caviling, if you will, to not just accept the clear-cut evidence that's right in front of our faces, right? Well, the problem is the analogy ought to be more like this. You got a great big house and a murder takes place in it. A butler at one time in the past 10 years had showed up at the house.
Yes.
There was a gun. It was a .32 caliber gun.
Yeah.
All of the ammunition that was ever discovered in the house was .44 caliber. There were no eyewitnesses of any kind, no spy cameras, no nothing. But there was a butler who showed up. So the butler did it. That's more like the inferences from the actual evidence that's taking place. And notice how he minimizes the gaps. Wildly. There's a few gaps. Mostly we have a rich vein of fossils to mine from. Okay, well, we're going to go into the paleontological community and look today at their best case. I mean, human evolution is a joke. It has not been demonstrated. I highly recommend you buy a book by Dr. Lubino called Bones of Contention. Dr. Lubino is one of the very few paleontological scientists who actually has physically held the majority of these bones that are in existence, that are the basis of human evolutionary theory. And he said if you took the actual bones, collected up all the bones, not extrapolations, not casts based upon where they think bones ought to go, but take the actual bones that have been discovered and put it all collectively together, you could fit it into a small box. And then he goes through each one of the major links and utterly discredits them. It's a beautifully done book. Highly recommend it. The same problems that you see extrapolated out in Lubino's book are the same problems of paleontology in general. As a matter of fact, to the extent that Karl Popper, you remember the famous philosopher of science Karl Popper, falsificationism, Karl Popper flat out said and wrote repeatedly that paleontology is not even a science. That paleontology is so fluffy, so disconnected from the actual evidence, so based on inferences and wishful thinking that it is not even actually a science. Now later, 15 years later, he finally retracted that statement and said, it can be a science if it's properly done, but not much of a backpedaling. And the fact is paleontology, well, as we're going to see today, paleontology as it's commonly done is piles of wishful thinking. And yet you have guys like Dawkins standing up there with scientific credibility. Dawkins is one of the most well-known scientists on the planet, saying with scientific credibility, we know this, we are certain of this. She swung agilely through the trees on the basis of this fragmented bits and pieces of what probably are not even ape bones. I mean, who knows what these creatures are? We're talking wild extrapolation. You had a question?
What his reasoning? Tell me what, just briefly, what he said. You can throw the fossil record out. He kept saying, and evolution will still stand.
Right, and notice that he says he has an entire chapter of his book devoted to the evolution that's occurring right before our very eyes. Well, we've looked at this, right?
Yeah.
And what you have are appeals to adaptation that are not even adaptation. And what you have is then inferential leaps based on zero evidence to claim that from this kind of adaptation, accumulate it long enough, well, wait, but no, that gets you into the fossil record, accumulate it enough, and you get things like ring speciation. How, wait, that has been totally debunked by the scientists themselves to the point where the lead researcher from UC San Diego, a biologist, not a paleontologist, says, and I've quoted it to you repeatedly, and he's not alone. I mean, there's so many scientists that are willing to come out. They're evolutionists. They haven't abandoned evolution, but they'll tell you flat out, we don't see speciation happening. So Dawkins is making grand summaries on the basis of not being factual about the evidence. No, I'm not saying he lied. I'm saying, as what happens in paradigms, you see the world through the paradigm's filters and all evidence. And hey, look, are creationists guilty of this? Absolutely. It is the human condition to assess evidence to fit it into your existing web of beliefs. You want an integrated web of beliefs. That's what you think means you know something. So that's just what they're doing. But what I'm trying to accomplish is to say, let's give them their evidence as they perceive it, but then let's back up and see, are their inferences good? So Gould and Eldredge respond in 1977. Actually, the theory of punctuated equilibria got published in 72, but this is a summary from 77. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the wait. I got to reread this again because that doesn't correlate with what Dawkins just said. There's very few gaps in the fossil record. We've just got the fossil record littered with transitional forms, according to Dawkins. Paleontologists, let's see. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence that we get from the fossils. And he's thinking in terms of things like whale transitional forms that we're going to look at. So I mean, he's appealing to the best of the evidence, and we have a handful of possible transitional lineages that are constantly touted and cited in the literature, the whale lineage being arguably the best of them. So that's what he's referring to, and he still says, not Dawkins. No, Dawkins, you're wrong. It's extremely rare to find transitional forms, and this is a trade secret among paleontologists. We know this. We know that what we're telling the public isn't based on the evidence from the fossils themselves, but Dawkins goes even beyond. Man, we've got this amazingly rich vein to mine from. From 1995, Gould writes, before Niles Eldredge and I proposed the theory of punctuated equilibrium in 1972, the stasis, or non-change, of most fossil species during their lengthy geological spans had been tacitly acknowledged by all paleontologists. Not most, not some. We all knew, according to Gould, we all knew that the majority of what you see in the fossil record is stasis, non-change. Nothing's happening. But that's almost never studied explicitly because prevailing theory treats stasis as uninteresting non-evidence for non-evolution. Now, if you're an evolutionist, what good is the fossil record to you if 90+% of it is non-evidence for non-evolution? Now notice, both Gould, Eldredge, the theory of punctuated equilibria, and Dawkins, both of these camps are orthodox. Neither of them, you see, creationists love, I'm trying to say too many things at the same moment here. Gould and Eldredge were extremely honest. And Gould was arguably the most popular scientist, most widely read scientist that there's ever been. He's got so many books out, extremely compelling writer, very honest, very forthright. I have tremendous respect for Gould because of his honesty, his willingness to tackle the hard things. Now here's the thing. Creationists have hopped on Gould's honesty about quotes like we just saw and have actually said Gould is anti-evolution. Gould actually doesn't believe in evolution. Gould believes in stasis. The theory of punctuated equilibria is really a bash on Darwinism. And creationists constantly take Gould's quotes and wrest them from their proper context and have Gould saying and believing things that he did not say nor believe. Gould went to his grave frustrated by how creationists had misused his writings. That troubles me a lot. I mean, we're going to today really bag on paleontology, but just keep, as you're pointing the finger at paleontologists, keep pointing 3 fingers back at the creationist community, right? I mean, we are not non-guilty in this debate. Our community is rife with shoddy scholarship, misquotations, misappropriation of beliefs and quotes to people, literal fabrication of quotes, wresting things out of context. The litany goes on and on and on. We have not been intellectually responsible either. So as I'm bashing on paleontology today, I am not singling them out for special condemnation. Their bad scholarship is our bad scholarship. We do the exact same things. It's the human condition. Dawkins is not lying. He's seeing through his filters. We do the exact same thing. If there's anything I hope you're taking from this seminar, it is the effort, continually, the effort to back up and say, why am I seeing this the way I am? Why am I interpreting this the way I am? Is this a legitimate interpretation from the evidence that actually is before me? Be intellectually honest. If you get nothing else out of this seminar but the mantra, intellectual honesty, intellectual honesty, intellectual honesty, get that. We're going to actually laugh at some of what we see in a couple of minutes here. 3 fingers pointed back at us. They laugh at us, and the indictment is legitimate. Okay. They are both orthodox. They're Darwinian. They believe in gradualism. They believe the fossil record has gaps. The question is, how do you deal with the gaps? Creationists magnify the gaps. Dawkins minimizes the gaps. Gould and Eldridge come along and say, it's mostly gaps. It's mostly we don't get anything that could be even remotely interpreted as transitional fossils. But what are we going to do with it? Dawkins lives the paradigm, right? I mean, he's in it. He defends it. He's not going to acknowledge that there's any serious problem there. There's no anomalies. Everything's hunky-dory. Gould and Eldridge are actually doing normal science in the context of the paradigm. What they're doing is saying there is an anomaly. We recognize the anomaly. We're going to solve the anomaly. In Kuhnian terms, this is normal science within the paradigm. But at least Gould and Eldridge are trying to explain how speciation is occurring given the state of the fossils. So let's turn now to the fossils. There are a few touted transitional lineages. They include horse evolution, cichlid evolution, mollusk evolution, whale evolution. There are some classic sort of textbook diagrams that you'll see where you'll see a shell of a certain size and shape and certain line patterns, and then another one beside it with slightly different and slightly different and slightly different, and they'll show you these transitional forms spanning millions of years and come to conclude, look, over the course of 20 million years here, we got speciation. These are different mollusks now. Well, same thing with human evolution. Again, read Bones of Contention. Bottom line is we're going to turn to one. We can't look at them all. We're going to look at whale evolution. This is arguably the strongest. If you look through the literature, this is the one that keeps rising to the top. Now, Talk Origins website. I highly encourage you to go to Talk Origins. This is sort of the clearinghouse of online information about evolutionary theory, cosmology, and so forth. Very anti-creationism, very atheistic website, but contains a wealth of resources about what they're thinking regarding any given particular argument. So, Talk Origins Sites has an entire page devoted to whale evolution, very systematically done analysis of the fossils, and comes up with these fossil transitions. Cynonyx, and we're going to look at each one of these. Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, that's a really interesting. You might not notice from the name, but you've heard, is he ambulatory? In other words, can he walk? Okay, Ambulocetus was the name given by the discoverer of this fossil to mean walking whale. It's a transitional fossil in the whale evolution because it's a whale that walks, Ambulocetus. Okay, I believe that's Rhodocetus. Basilosaurus, Durodon. We're going to look at each one of these. These are the major fossils discovered that scientists believe show a multi tens of millions of years evolutionary transition through from Sinonyx all the way to Durodon, which then they believe is the obvious precursor to modern whales. So now we're going to watch the fossil record video and see how these are employed. We don't see video.
The following video demonstrates that the theory of evolution is useful for making sense out of biological observations. One of the most common misconceptions about evolution concerns the topic of intermediate forms. The claim is all too often made that there are no transitional or intermediate forms in the fossil record. But what does the evidence say? Here's how the National Academy of Sciences answered that question in 1999. So many intermediate forms have been discovered that it is often difficult to identify categorically when the transition occurs from one to another particular species. Actually, nearly all fossils can be regarded as intermediates in some sense. They are life forms that come between the forms that preceded them and those that followed. So, what are we to make of the claim that there are no intermediate forms in the fossil record? As it turns out, those who make the claim are usually harboring fundamental misconceptions about how evolution works. For instance, child star Kirk Cameron has repeatedly argued that the theory of evolution is wrong because no one has ever found fossil evidence of a species that resembles a cross between a crocodile and a duck. Unfortunately for Mr. Cameron, this argument does nothing to disprove modern evolutionary theory. It merely reveals that he does not understand it. Such misunderstandings compel people like Cameron to ignore or fail to recognize the copious examples of intermediate forms that do exist in the fossil record. In order to better understand what evolution actually predicts about intermediate forms, it helps to consider an analogy. Imagine that you are looking at a comprehensive family photo album. There is a picture of you on the first page of the album, a picture of your mother on the next page, your mother's mother on the next page, and so on. As you flip between the first two pages, you can immediately tell that you and your mother are related. You clearly share certain physical characteristics, such as the shape and size of your nose or the color of your hair. As you continue to flip through the album, going back many generations, it is quite obvious that the members of any particular generation are related to the next, due to their shared physical characteristics. Sometimes you might even find that you share certain traits with some of your distant ancestors, even though these traits seem to have disappeared in the intervening generations. Now let's imagine that, on a whim, you stop flipping through the album and turn back to examine the page with your own photo on it. When you return to the page that you stopped on, it seems like something is wrong. You and the person you're looking at share no obvious similarities. Even though you look nothing alike, you know for certain that this woman is one of your direct ancestors. At some point in this climb down your family tree, your ancestors stopped looking like you. Fortunately, you have a complete photographic record of every generation in between, so it is easy for you to observe the transitional stages between this unfamiliar face and your own. Now imagine a family photo album that goes back in time for billions of years. It includes a photo of every single generation in the line of descent that led to you, all the way back to the first living thing. As you quickly flip through the album, going through several strange and unfamiliar intermediate forms along the way, you eventually end up at the common ancestor of all living things. You can still observe a smooth transition between each form, because every photo shows only a small difference from the one that comes before it and after it. Okay, let's make this scenario a little more realistic. All of your ancestors are not in the photo album. A lot of them simply refuse to have their picture taken. For others, the photos are not particularly flattering or informative. Many of the existing photos are damaged or incomplete. Other photos have simply disintegrated over time. The album itself has also suffered significant damage, having been caught outside in stormy weather, singed in house fires, and simply worn out through the constant flipping of pages. Some of the pages of the album may even have been shuffled around or turned upside down as it was passed from one generation to the next. You might even have to perform a little detective work to get some of the photos put back in the correct order. Clearly, this more realistic photo album is still a record of your family history. It's just not as complete as you would like it to be. When you flip through the pages, you occasionally see jumps in the images instead of the smooth transitions like before. For a while, the photos represent one form, but then you come to a gap after which the photos show a different form without a smooth transition in between. Because this is your family photo album, you know that each of these transitions still took place, you just no longer have all of the photos to document each and every intermediate step. Obviously, the fact that you no longer have photos of some of your ancestors does not mean that they never existed. It's just that some of the photos have been lost to the ravages of time. Even so, when you show the album to other people, they can still learn a lot about your family history from the photos that remain, despite the gaps. As you have probably guessed, this realistic photo album represents the true fossil record. Due to the fact that fossilization is an extremely rare event, the fossil record could never provide evidence of every single species that ever existed. However, the fossils we do have provide plenty of evidence to tell a very compelling story of the history of our lineage. Moreover, every other existing species also has its own family album, with its own unique story to tell. But it turns out that Kirk Cameron is right in one sense. The theory of evolution does predict that some fossil forms should exhibit a mix of characteristics that link modern organisms to older, very different organisms. Evolution would be falsified if there were no such intermediate forms in the fossil record. But what exactly are these intermediate forms expected to look like? Well, it should now be obvious that each and every fossil in the fossil record represents a species that was fully formed. Indeed, the notion that a species could be anything other than fully formed is utterly meaningless. Every fossil specimen represents a fully evolved species. The misconception here is the idea that a transitional fossil should look half like an ancestor and half like a descendant. As we've just seen, that is not how evolution really works. Evolution primarily occurs by refashioning old features into new ones. Therefore, evolutionary theory predicts that transitional forms should appear as modified versions of pre-existing forms, not as amalgamations of the modern representatives of related groups. Consequently, the reason that we do not find evidence of bizarre animal amalgamations in the fossil record, like Kirk Cameron's crocoduck example, is because such forms could not possibly have evolved. Indeed, the discovery of such a farcical animal in the fossil record would be regarded as evidence against evolution, not for it. Evolution is a powerful theory because it does not merely predict that there will be intermediate forms, it also allows us to predict which intermediate forms should be found, and when these forms should have existed. These predictions must be consistent with our current knowledge about evolutionary relationships, based on all of the available data sets, including evidence from morphological, genetic, and embryological studies. Once again, evolution could be falsified by the discovery of a fossil that is inconsistent with these other lines of evidence. For example, evolution predicts intermediate forms between ancient land mammals and whales, because the morphological and genetic evidence indicates that whales are the descendants of land mammals. Intermediate forms should therefore exhibit traits that are transitional between these distinct groups. In addition, these intermediate forms should be found to have existed prior to the earliest recognizable modern whales, which show up in the fossil record about 30 million years ago. After decades of digging, such intermediate forms have indeed been discovered, in remarkable abundance and in precisely the order that makes evolutionary sense. Evolution also tells us which intermediate forms should not be found. Despite their superficial similarities, no intermediate forms are predicted between whale sharks and whales. This is because the morphological and genetic evidence indicates that whale sharks and whales are not closely related. The discovery of such a fossil would actually be evidence against evolution. No such anachronistic fossil forms have ever been discovered. So, what have we learned? Well, hopefully you can now understand why scientists do not take seriously the claim that there are no intermediate forms in the fossil record. An honest look at the fossil record consistently confirms several predictions based on evolutionary theory. First, we find that some fossil forms exhibit a mix of intermediate characteristics that link an older group of organisms to a younger group. Second, contrary to the popular misconception, we do not find fossil evidence of organisms that are merely a cross between existing groups. Such a find would actually contradict evolutionary theory. Finally, when we find authentic intermediate forms, they occur in the fossil record precisely when and where they should. To support this last point, in my next video I will present several examples of fossil intermediate forms that were predicted to exist before they were actually discovered. Thus, we will demonstrate the usefulness of evolutionary theory for making sense out of biological observations. I'm Jeremy Moan. Thanks for watching my video. This video lesson has been brought to you by Stand Up for Real Science, a website devoted to defending the teaching of mainstream science in public school science classrooms.
So stand up for real science. All right. Biggest problem with this video, and I talk about this on the website, deeply question begging. The line in there, we know this is our family album, so the fact that we see gaps and so forth and we see differences, that doesn't trouble us because we know that, but wait, that's the very thing that's at question, is whether or not the the fossil record is an evidence of evolutionary lineage to us, whether it is really our family album in the sense that it's being portrayed. That's what's at issue. That's the question, how to interpret the fossil record. The only way that analogy begins to be interesting is if you already do presume it is your family album, but that's the very thing we don't presume. There's another big problem. You'll notice that he briefly shows this family tree, right? And all of the documentation shows a tree. But what we know from the Cambrian explosion and what we know from Gould and Eldridge's research and very forthright discussion and the very existence of the theory of punctuated equilibria is that the fossil record does not show a tree. The fossil record shows, if anything, a bush with all kinds of shoots appearing simultaneously. But evolutionists can't have it be a bush. Why? Well, the simple reason is because it is so incredibly unlikely. The odds against evolutionary theory are so astronomically high that the retreat of evolutionists has always been to, it only had to happen once, and it took hundreds and hundreds, indeed billions of years. We have fossils going back 3.5 billion years. Little single-celled organisms, but you've got 3.5 billion years of evolution going from very, very simple forms, a start, incredibly unlikely, granted, very unlikely. It didn't happen a bunch of times, we grant that, but it did happen once. And so the tree is important because of the unlikelihood of a bush. But yet what the fossil record shows is, particularly in the Cambrian explosion, dozens of major body types suddenly appearing in the fossil record with absolutely no precursors, and from there, even granting them their idea of evolution out of these various major body forms, you still end up with increasing bushiness throughout the fossil record. There is nothing in the fossil record to indicate anything resembling the tree that you so constantly see portrayed. The tree does not exist, and I repeat that as strongly as I can. There is no evidence for a tree in the fossil record. So when you see evolutionists trotting out the family tree or showing this long, gigantic photo album like it's a lineage, ridiculous. There is zero evidence in the fossil record for a tree. All right, well, what are these fossils really? Okay, let's go through these one by one pretty quickly. Cynonyx, a wolf-sized creature with an elongated muzzle, that is, now watch the quotes, look for the loaded language, often associated with hunting fish. You got an elongated muzzle, creatures with elongated muzzles, they often hunt fish. All fish-hunting whales, as well as dolphins, have elongated muzzles. These features were atypical of mesonaucids, indicating that Cynonyx was already developing the adaptation that later became the basis of whales' specialized way of life. Now, we're going to see pictures of some of these as we go along here. And I want you to think now. We've got a four-legged animal with an elongated muzzle. Could be a dog. I mean, it's wolf-sized, but it's a whale precursor because of the evidence that you just read. Now, another thing you saw in the video is how does it evaluate between you, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents? What's the model upon which you're seeing a resemblance? Well, it's morphological, right? It's the taxonomic species concept. It's the idea that I look a lot like my relatives, therefore I'm related. That's the inference. I look like them, therefore I'm related. I go far enough back, I no longer look like them. But I know that I'm related already, so that tells me something significant. But notice the question begging here. I don't know that I'm related to these fossils. I don't know that Sinonux is in any way related to whales. The only evidence I have that this thing could possibly be related to whales is it has an elongated muzzle, and so do dolphins. I know that sounds really pathetic, but this is Talk Origins. This is their analysis. They're telling us now, and on the website where I actually give you additional information, I quote them as saying, creationists perpetually are not getting what the fossil record actually shows. This page is devoted to, and I believe I can quote this, convince the honest skeptic. So the idea is, you're a creationist, you're a skeptic about evolution, come to this page, look at this evidence, and if you're at all honest, you're going to be convinced to no longer be a skeptic about evolution. So as you go through this lineage, keep in mind, the designers of this web page trotted this out as the example that was going to convince an honest skeptic. So I went into that with high expectations. I'm like, I'm a skeptic, I believe I'm honest, I'm going to weigh the evidence. Okay? I'm not finding that too doggone impressive. I'm sorry, but I just don't find that too impressive. Pakicetus. Again, I'm quoting from Talk Origins here. This is their argument of how wonderful this fossil lineage is. Although it is known only from fragmentary skull remains, these remains are very diagnostic. We know it swung agilely through trees. Wait, no, that's a different fossil. This one didn't swing agilely through trees. It's very diagnostic, definitely intermediate between Sinonux and later whales. Definitely. We know this from skull fragments. Okay. I say, you can't make this stuff up, right? I mean, remember, convince an honest skeptic. 2 so far, I'm calling it zip for 2. I'm not in the slightest impressed by the inferences drawn from a few fragments of bone. Okay, back to Ambulocetus, right? The walking whale. This is what they say. Ambulocetus is a truly amazing fossil. Emphasis on the singular A. A few remains have been found that are called possibly, likely, Ambulocetus, but we have only one fairly complete skeleton. Much has been made of that one truly amazing, single, partial, incomplete skeleton. Remember, we're looking for morphology here, right? Morphology is going to tell the tale of the lineage. From that very partial, incomplete skeleton, single skeleton, we have this species as it's usually rendered by artists. And look, it's a swimmer, like a whale would be. And it has an elongated snout, like dolphins would have. And yet, its legs clearly mean it could walk on land. So it's whale-like, but it's a land mammal, kind of in the water, out of the water. We can extrapolate all of this from bone fragments of a partial skeleton. Look at all the details. It's got webbed feet, right? It's swimming. I mean, you see the hind legs are acting in a power stroke, right? I mean, this thing is a swimmer. We are certain the fossil record is extremely diagnostic in this case. We can look at the bones and we know this. Well, that's the actual Ambulocetus fossil. Now notice, the top one, A, that is what was published in National Geographic magazine as what they have in the way of the fossil. It looks pretty good. Notice the power stroke. The hind legs are in the swimming power. This is exactly how it was portrayed in National Geographic magazine. And you couple that skeleton with the artist's renditions of swimming through the water, put it together with some luminaries like Dawkins saying, this is as compelling of evidence as any creationist could ever want to see. Talk Origins saying, this is going to convince any honest skeptic, except that the lower one is really what they have. And it's worse. The bones that you see in red, They actually were found in strata 5 meters above the rest of the skeleton. Now, think about what that means if you're an evolutionist. They make much of the fact that 120 meters of strata separate several of these fossils. Well, if 120 meters is supposed to be really significant because of the amount of time passage, why are those bones in red that were found 15 meters? I mean, what time span are we talking about here? But in time, 15 meters of layering and stratification, finally you get the bones that they just included into this fossil. Who knows why those bones are there? But this is extremely amazing. This is an amazing fossil. Look at what's really there, especially when you take the bones in red out of there and recognize those bones just got added to the mix from strata 15 feet higher. And were you having your hand up? I'm sorry. Yeah, that's what I meant. I'm sort of going back and forth between 15 feet and 5 meters. So, yeah, a little over, about 16 feet, yeah. My problem is I don't think metrics. So.
Was that actual graphic there in National Geographic, or was it just A?
It was just A. And the website from which I drew this actually had the real fossil remains as it would have been represented were it in the configuration that National Geographic shows. Now, you put the fragments together. Remember, we have only one fairly complete Ambulocetus fossil, but they've got fragments. So you put it all together and you end up with this. Notice we've got some vertebrae hanging out the back there. Is that tail? Well, okay, call it tail. They know, right? They're the scientists. They're the experts. They know how this should go together. Clearly, we've got some ribs. I'll grant them that there's some ribs there. There's clearly some vertebrae. Notice the skull. Do you get elongated muzzle from the skull?
The lower jaw.
Well, but notice that the lower jaw is fragmented. How tight of a fit do fragments have to be, right? I mean, remember, look, the fossil record is a burnt-up book, okay? It's been subjected to the elements, lightning strikes, right? Remember the video, okay? The fossil record has undergone some trauma, okay? And so sometimes you have to piece things together from 15 feet apart in different strata, you know, widely diverse locations where it strains credulity to imagine how bones from 25 yards over there could possibly be from the same creature as the bones that you're digging up right here. But look, that's a vertebrae, this is a vertebrae. I mean, I'm not making this up. These guys are literally parting stuff together as it seems to them will best fit.
And isn't that what they also did with Lucy in terms of, I mean, 1,000 kilometers apart of where these fossils
various
were?
Fragments.
Yeah.
And most of the human fossilization turns out to be just outright fraudulent.
Yeah.
We're gonna get into some of that. You see what I have to basically call fraud in the development of some of these whale fossils. Okay, notice the pictorial representation, and now this is the new one. Okay, Rhodocetus. This is the next one in the lineage. That is how the artist's conception above is how it's actually portrayed in all of the literature, okay? If you look at the various documented diagrams that are, you know, in the various scientific journals or what's presented in National Geographic or Science or Discovery, the big magazines that show you how evolution works, you're going to see a thing that looks like that, the top picture. Sorry? Yeah, absolutely. You know, college textbooks. I mean, when evolution is taught to our future scientists, they see that thing. Well, if you X out the parts they don't have of this thing in the fossil, that's the body plan you're actually left with. There's no tail, there's no flukes, there's no flippers, there's no hind legs with flippers, there's no front legs with flippers, there's no webbed feet. None of what makes that into anything like whale interesting transitional fossil, none of it exists. None of it. Yeah, there's no swimmer there, right? You can't tell anything. Oh, wow. Why are we whipping like this? Come on, back up.
Richard, you know, when we just took a group of students up to the Natural History Museum in Denver, and they have a huge whale exhibit that's featured right now. And they have a docent who is actually you stop by and visit the docent, and the docent points out to the huge whale fossil that's hanging suspended from the ceiling. And the one lesson that he's taught to instruct to all of the visitors is, look at the hip. Look at the hip bone. Do you see that hip bone? And he asks the kids, middle school, high school kids, what does that look like? Oh, it looks like your hip bone, doesn't it? Do you see the whale? The whale has a hip bone that would then eventually evolve into yours. So the whale moves from swimmer to, and then all of a sudden it's a quantum leap from swimmer to a hip that allows you to walk.
Right. And it depends on which way they want to flip it at any given moment, because in this transition, they've got to get us from land animals to sea-dwelling mammals. So the transition goes from the whale has the kind of pelvis it has because it was originally a land animal. Or they can flip it on its head and say, well, look, mammals have this kind of characteristic, and the whole evolution of mammals gives you this kind of pelvis, and look, you know, we've got that and we've got vestigial hind limbs in some whales, right? And all this is magnified. All right. In that fossil, I'm sorry, I'm really running out of time here, so I'm going to try to forge ahead here. The tail and flippers and even pelvis, the pelvis, were complete fabrications. Dr. Philip Gingrich is the guy who runs around the world digging these things up, and as Irwin was with the green warbler, Gingrich is to whale evolution. These guys find a niche, and they become expert in it. And so Gingrich has dug up a number of the species that are now considered to be transitional forms in whale evolution. All right, wishful thinking on the part of Dr. Philip Gingrich. Now let's watch the Gingrich interview. This is only a couple of minutes, but watch closely. This is so telling.
When this video series was being filmed on location at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, the executive producer noticed a discrepancy between museum drawings of Rhodocetus and the fossils. The reconstruction of Rhodocetus had a whale fluke, but there were no fossils of the tail to confirm this. Dr. Phil Gingrich, the scientist responsible for the discovery and reconstruction of Rhodocetus, was questioned how he knew there was a whale fluke on Rhodocetus, since that part of the fossil was missing.
What was the reasoning that the scientists think there was a fluke on Rhodocetus based on the other pieces of anatomy?
Well, I told you we don't have the tail in Rhodocetus, so we don't know for sure whether it had a ball vertebra indicating a fluke or not. So I speculated it might have had a fluke.
Scientist Gingrich also acknowledged that the flippers were drawn on the diagram without these fossils. Now, he does not believe this animal had flippers. Again, his answer was surprising, since the museum diagrams had flippers on Rhodocetus.
Now, since then, we've found the forelimbs, the hands, and the front arm, the arms, in other words, of Rhodocetus. And we understand that it doesn't have the kind of arms that can be spread out like flippers are on a whale. And if you don't have flippers, I don't think you can have a fluke tail and really powered swimming. And so I now doubt that Rhodocetus would have had a fluke tail.
Many experts consider whales to be the best fossil evidence for evolution, but are unaware of these discrepancies.
So how does the public get these drawings that are trotted out in all the popular literature showing you clearly, you start out with this thing, over time it looks more like this thing, Over time, it looks more like this thing, and finally you get whales. Again and again in these videos, you've seen these transitional drawings. What the public is not told, when you go to the museum, when you see these reconstructions, what you're not told is how little actual fossil material is being used to extrapolate out how these things look. I'm going to find it. There's a really great, I think it was a Discovery Channel video, that was doing computer simulations based on fossils of T-Rexes. You know, T-Rex has always been the mighty, upright, you know, hunter. Well, they're now coming to conclude doing computer simulations that are actually extremely accurate, you know, based upon how various kinds of creatures move based upon their skeletal structure, that T-Rex probably was not this mighty, upright hunter, but actually was forced to walk along in a position like this, sort of hobbling along, and probably was just a carrion eater. What they extrapolate from even pretty significantly well-reconstructed fossil material, you can't even get clear as to whether this thing walked upright or whether it walked hunched over, whether it was a mighty hunter or whether it was a scavenger. You can't get clear on any of this stuff from even extremely complete fossils, and yet these guys in the whale lineage are taking fragments. Notice he said, we have since found the front arms of Rhodocetus. Wait, you didn't find those in the same dig that you found the original fairly complete fossil. You found those elsewhere. Then how do you know those are Rhodocetus front arms? I mean, the chains and chains and chains of inference that take place here to reconstruct this stuff, but it's all trotted out to the public as though we know. This is certain, okay? Look, if you are an intellectually honest skeptic about evolution, go to this Talk Origins page and be convinced. I did. I went there. I tried to be convinced. And yet again, I find myself infuriated, not convinced, but infuriated by the flat-out fabrications that are trotted out to the public as fact and are given the air of scientific credibility when it is speculation, and it is admitted by the leading researchers, we made this stuff up out of whole cloth. This was no swimmer. Okay, so we watched the Gingrich interview. Basilosaurus. Gingrich, again, unearthing this in Egypt. There was actually quite a few of these. They've been discovered all over the world, including many in Alabama. We've got two mostly complete skeletons. One's on exhibit in the Smithsonian, the other in Birmingham. This is probably the thing that you saw there in Denver, I'd be my guess, because this is the transitional form that they have the most of. But it's a fish-like, whale-like thing. I mean, there's absolutely no reason to think that this is in the family lineage of modern whales. I mean, even if you grant them all their evidence, there's no reason to get from the fact that you have this swimming fish-like thing, and here's why. Gingrich, when asked about assembling the fossil that actually was going into the University of Michigan, this very fossil that was going to be hung from the ceiling at the University of Michigan, in that context, Gingrich writes, just the act of mounting the skeleton makes you think about how the bones really fit together and confront uncertainties that you would never realize you didn't understand until you try to put them together. In other words, it's a 3D jigsaw puzzle, and, you know, we're doing the best we can. We think it goes like this. There's lots of uncertainties. Well, why do you think it goes like this? Because you want it to go like that, right? You want to see intermediary whales. You want to. Your research depends upon you finding these intermediary steps. So you find them. And so in the first video that we saw that was talking about everywhere we look, we see what evolution has predicted is going to be there. Evolution predicts that there should be a thing that looks like that. Therefore, we go out and we find it. How convenient. Yes, it's an amazing imagination these guys have. Henry Gee, chief science writer for Nature. These guys, I'm I'm not trotting out no-name nobodies. You notice that consistently, I'm talking about luminaries. I'm talking about leaders in the field. I'm talking about the most credible people I can lay my hands on. I'm not trying to straw man their case. I'm doing everything in my power to find the most representative, strongest arguments from the luminaries in the field. And this guy writes, the intervals of time that separate fossils are so huge that we cannot say anything definite about their possible connection through ancestry and descent. There's telling the truth. So much time and space separates these transitionals that relations are pure speculation. Even the construction of them is pure speculation. Finally, the last guy just before modern whales, Durodon. Here we do have something that probably was mostly whale-like. Gingrich, again, the lead researcher again writes, this probably represents the group most likely to be ancestral to modern whales. Wait. I thought they all were. I thought we've got one lineage going from this wolf-like thing to the blue whale. That's what I thought. That's what I was taught. That's what I was shown. That's what all of your pictorial diagrams show as the lineage. That's what you're trotting out to the public. That's what you're saying is the strongest case we have of a lineage is the whale evolution, and look at these amazing transitional forms, but yet this guy himself, the lead researcher, is flat out saying, probably of all of them, this is the one that is most likely to be ancestral to modern whales. The rest of them might have nothing whatsoever to do with modern whales. We might not have a lineage there at all. But notice even how he says it. Probably represents the group most likely to be in the lineage of modern whales. Probably, most likely, this whale-like thing, because it looks something like some of our modern whales, probably, yeah, we're going to call it good. So the real picture is, and this is my summary here of, I took a diagram from the internet that's a classic example of the way they show the whale lineage, and then I added my own notes based on the actual facts, and there is, on the left, your chain of species, and on the right, well, okay, there's Cynonox. What? That's headed toward whale? Sorry, I'm not going with you on that. Not even. Pakicetus, you've got a partial skull. Fragmented, busted up. You reassembled it into something, and it's whale-like, okay? So it's in the lineage. Wow, Ambulocetus, you've got a partial skeleton. You don't have big, important parts of it, yet you know what it looks like, and you know it's whale-like. All right, Rhodocetus, the worst of the lot, almost completely fabricated, looks nothing like the way it's pictorially represented. There's no fossil evidence to sustain the way it's pictorially represented. The thing was likely not a swimmer. There's no evidence to suggest it was, but it's whale-like and it's in the whale lineage. Okay, finally, Basilosaurus, fairly complete. What is it? What relation does it have to the whale lineage? And then finally, Durodon, probably, likely, blah, 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 and then the admissions that, well, you know, we don't have the foggiest clue. That's the fact of the matter. And a UC Berkeley summary on this very point diagrams the whale lineage, but places them all as Indian